When I walked into that courtroom, my parents were already smiling cold, victorious smiles that once terrified me as a child. They thought they'd won before the trial even began. After all, who would believe me, the daughter they'd abandoned 20 years ago, over them, the glamorous Whitmores everyone adored on TV? But this time, the game was different. My grandfather, the only person who ever truly loved me, had died, leaving his billion-dollar estate entirely to me. And now, the people who once left me crying on his doorstep were suing me for it. As I stood before the judge, my heart pounded. Then he looked up, studying me for a long moment. Suddenly, his eyes widened. "Wait," he said, his voice trembling. "You're her?" The room fell silent. My parents' smug expressions cracked because they realized the truth was about to destroy their perfect lie. I was 5 years old the day my parents vanished from my life. The sun in Santa Barbara was cruel that afternoon, too bright, too hot, burning everything it touched except the part of me that went cold. My mother, Victoria, knelt in front of me in her white summer dress, her perfume heavy with lilac and lies. "Be good for Grandpa, okay, darling?" she said, forcing a smile. Her lipstick was too red, her eyes too dry. My father, Charles, stood beside the car, tapping the hood impatiently. "Vic, let's go. We'll miss the flight." "Flight?" I asked, clutching the hem of her dress. "Where are you going? Can I come?" She froze for a heartbeat. "It's just a short trip, sweetheart. We'll be back before you know it." But even at 5, I heard the tremor in her voice. She didn't hug me. She kissed the air near my cheek, her earrings brushing my face. Then she turned and walked away, heels clicking like a countdown. The car door slammed, the tires spun on the gravel, and their silver convertible disappeared behind the tall iron gates. I ran after it until my lungs screamed, until my small legs gave out. The scent of dust and gasoline filled my nose. I screamed for them, but the only answer was the wind and the distant cry of seagulls. Then a hand rested on my shoulder, steady, warm, grounding. Grandpa Henry knelt beside me. He wasn't the kind of man who spoke in rushes. Every word he said carried the weight of truth. His gray eyes softened as he brushed the dirt from my knees. "They don't know what they've lost, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice trembling just slightly. "But you," he paused, lifting my chin so I'd meet his gaze. "You will never be unwanted again." He scooped me up in his arms, as if I weighed nothing, and carried me back toward the mansion. I remember resting my head against his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It was the first time I'd felt safe that day. That night, I sat in the enormous kitchen, swinging my legs from the high stool as he made me cocoa himself. No servants, just him. "You like extra marshmallows, right?" he asked with a small smile. I nodded through the tears that wouldn't stop. When he tucked me into bed, the house felt too big, the silence too deep. The ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like footsteps that would never return. "Will they come back for me?" I whispered. He hesitated, then smoothed my hair. "Some doors, my dear Emma, once closed, should stay that way." Before he turned off the lamp, he added quietly, "But you'll never have to chase love again. From now on, it lives right here." And as the shadows stretched across the room, I clutched his hand and believed him. That was the night I stopped waiting for my parents and started belonging to someone who never left. Life with Grandpa Henry was nothing like the movies made about billionaires. His mansion sat on the Santa Barbara cliffs, overlooking the Pacific like a quiet fortress. But inside, there were no glittering parties or endless staff rushing about. Instead, there was structure, discipline, and most of all purpose. He woke me at 6 every morning. "Up, Emma. The world doesn't wait for the lazy," he'd say, knocking gently on my door. I would drag myself to the kitchen, where he'd already be seated with his black coffee and a newspaper spread across the marble counter. "Read this," he'd say, pointing at the headlines. "Then, tell me what they're not saying." At first, I didn't understand. I was just a child, trying to finish her cereal. But as the years passed, I learned his real lesson. Never take a story at face value. Truth, he believed, always lived beneath the surface, and sometimes you had to dig through dirt to find it. He was the founder of Whitmore Industries, a global shipping and logistics company that connected continents. But to him, the empire mattered less than integrity. Money, he often said, is like salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you get. So make sure your thirst is for the right things. I watched how people treated him. Politicians shook his hand, lawyers sought his advice, and employees feared disappointing him. Yet he was never cruel, just firm, fair, honest. When I was 10, he brought me to his office for the first time. The glass towers downtown glimmered against the sunset. Inside, everyone greeted him with respect and me with curiosity. "This is my granddaughter," he introduced proudly. "One day, she'll ask harder questions than any of you." I remember smiling shyly as he placed his hand on my shoulder. It wasn't about grooming me for power, it was about teaching me to see the world clearly. Every weekend, he'd drive us to the community center he funded. While other billionaires donated for publicity, Grandpa stayed for hours, helping children read or teaching them how to balance a checkbook. "Power means nothing," he'd whisper to me, "if you use it to rise alone." At 16, I found my parents' faces again, this time on TV. They were laughing on a red carpet in Los Angeles, promoting a reality show about second chances. I remember holding the remote tightly until my knuckles turned white. Grandpa entered the room quietly, watching the screen. "Do you miss them?" he asked. I wanted to say yes, but instead, I whispered, "Not anymore." He nodded slowly. "Good. Missing people who left you is like staring at closed doors. You'll never notice the open ones." That night, he gave me my first real gift, an old, leather-bound journal. "For your truth," he said. "One day, the world will try to rewrite it. Don't let them." I didn't realize it then, but that journal would one day save me in the same courtroom where my parents tried to destroy me. The morning my grandfather died, the world felt wrong. The air was too still, the ocean too quiet. I found him in his study, slumped over his desk, his reading glasses still resting on the open pages of his journal. The last thing he'd written was just one line. "Truth, in the wrong hands, turns to poison." I didn't cry right away. I just stood there, numb, staring at the man who had been my world, the man who had replaced everything I'd lost. When the grief finally came, it tore through me like a storm. The funeral drew half the city. Billionaires, judges, former presidents, everyone wanted to be seen honoring Henry Whitmore, the man who built an empire with honesty. But all I wanted was one more hour with him, one more lesson, one more cup of cocoa on a rainy night. Then I saw them, my parents, standing near the front row, dressed in black designer clothes, sunglasses hiding their expressions. My mother, Victoria, cried into a lace handkerchief, but even from a distance, I could tell the tears were fake. My father, Charles, looked bored, like he'd rather be anywhere else. When the ceremony ended, they approached me for the first time in 22 years. "Emma," my mother said softly, tilting her head. "You look so grown up." I stepped back. "You remembered my name. Impressive." Her smile flickered. "We're family. We should reconnect." "Family?" I echoed. "You left me with him like luggage you didn't want to carry." Charles's jaw tightened. "You always were dramatic." Before I could respond, Henry's lawyer, Mr. Samuel Briggs, called everyone into the estate office for the reading of the will. The guests murmured with curiosity. My heart hammered against my ribs. Samuel cleared his throat. "The late Judge Henry Whitmore leaves all assets, including the Whitmore mansion, businesses, and liquid holdings, to his granddaughter, Emma Whitmore." The room went silent. My mother gasped. "That's impossible." Charles slammed his palm against the table. He was old. He wasn't thinking clearly. "But," Samuel continued, his voice firm, "he also left a note to his son and daughter-in-law. It reads, 'Those who walk away from truth for comfort have already forfeited their inheritance.'" Victoria's lips parted, her voice trembling. "He can't do this. We're his children." Samuel looked directly at her. "He already gave you everything that mattered, a chance to be decent. You wasted it." I stood frozen, my fingers digging into the edge of the table. I had never seen my parents so exposed, stripped of their glamour, their practiced charm. As the crowd dispersed, my mother's mask cracked. "You'll regret this, Emma," she hissed. "You don't deserve a cent of what he built." I met her gaze steadily. Neither do you. Outside, the sea wind howled through the estate gates, scattering white petals from the wreaths. I realized then that grief and greed often arrive holding the same hand. And somewhere, I swear I could almost hear Grandpa's voice. Stand tall, Emma. The truth has long arms and it always reaches back. It started with a thick white envelope on my doorstep. No return address. Just my name, Emma Whitmore, written in bold, familiar handwriting. I tore it open, expecting condolences. Instead, my eyes froze on the first line. Notice of civil action. Charles and Victoria Whitmore versus Emma Whitmore, claim of undue influence. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My hands shook so violently I dropped the papers on the floor. My own parents were suing me, accusing me of manipulating my grandfather into leaving me everything. The media found out within hours. By nightfall, headlines screamed across the internet. Billionaire's granddaughter, sued by estranged parents for $1.6 estate. Paparazzi parked outside the gates, flashes of light cutting through the darkness like gunfire. My lawyer, Robert Hayes, called me early the next morning. His voice was calm, steady, the kind that only comes from decades of dealing with chaos. Emma, they're moving fast. Their attorneys filed in Los Angeles County. Your father still has influence there. Of course he does, I muttered. He always did, just never where it mattered. When we met in Robert's office later that day, he slid the documents toward me. They're claiming you isolated your grandfather in his final months. They say you controlled access, interfered with his doctors, and coerced him to alter the will. I laughed bitterly. Controlled access? He was the one protecting me from them. Robert sighed. Emma, I've seen nasty inheritance battles, but suing your own child? That's a new level. They're not my parents, I said quietly. They're strangers who share my blood. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa's last few weeks, the quiet dinners, his tired smile, the way his hand trembled when signing letters. I wondered if he knew they'd come after me. Maybe that's why he left the journal. Maybe that was his warning. 2 days later, a tabloid reporter ambushed me outside a cafe. Emma, is it true you brainwashed your grandfather? Did you threaten him? I stopped walking, turned toward the cameras, and said evenly, if loving the man who raised me is a crime, then I'm guilty. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a blocked call. Enjoying your fame? My mother's voice purred. Why are you doing this? I asked. Because you took what's ours, she said coldly. You stole our life. Now we'll take yours. Then she hung up. That night, I sat alone in the study, staring at Grandpa's old desk, the same one where he'd taught me to read legal documents. His photo stood beside his leather journal. I opened it, tracing the faded handwriting. When the truth is tested, stand still. Let them attack, they'll only wound themselves. I closed the book and exhaled. The fear was still there, but underneath it burned something stronger: resolve. They wanted war? Then they'd just declared it against the wrong Whitmore. The day of the first hearing arrived under a sky that looked bruised gray clouds pressing low over Los Angeles. Reporters lined the courthouse steps like vultures waiting for something to die. Maybe it was my reputation. Maybe it was theirs. Inside, the courtroom smelled of wood polish and tension. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table, perfectly staged for the cameras, my mother in a fitted black dress, my father in a tailored navy suit. They didn't look like grieving family. They looked like actors rehearsing for revenge. When I entered, whispers filled the gallery. That's her, the granddaughter, someone murmured. My heels clicked against the marble floor, each step steady, though my hands were trembling inside. Robert leaned close and whispered, Stay calm, Emma. Let the evidence speak for itself. At the bench sat a middle-aged man with silver hair and sharp, knowing eyes. Judge Marcus Nolan. His presence filled the room even before he spoke. When our eyes met, something flickered across his face. Recognition, disbelief, maybe both. He removed his glasses slowly. Miss Whitmore, he said, his voice softer than expected. Would you please approach the bench for a moment? My stomach twisted as I stepped forward. The courtroom hushed. When I stopped before him, he studied me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, You're Henry Whitmore's granddaughter. Yes, Your Honor, I replied. He nodded once, his expression shifting from surprise to solemn respect. I clerked for your grandfather, years ago. He once told me, if my granddaughter ever stands in your courtroom, listen carefully because she'll be telling the truth. A ripple of gasps spread through the gallery. Behind me, my mother's composure cracked. My father's jaw tightened. Judge Nolan straightened. Proceed, he said, but his tone carried an undercurrent. My parents' attorney clearly noticed, one that said integrity still means something here. Their lawyer, a slick man named Elliot Graves, wasted no time twisting the knife. Your Honor, he began smoothly, this young woman systematically alienated her elderly grandfather, restricted his communication, and manipulated his estate planning. We will prove her actions were fraudulent. Robert stood calmly. We welcome the chance to disprove every word, Your Honor. Then Graves smirked. She's quite composed for someone accused of stealing $1 billion. I met his eyes and said evenly, composure isn't guilt, Mr. Graves. It's confidence in the truth. A murmur of approval rippled through the observers. Even Judge Nolan's mouth twitched in what might have been a restrained smile. As the proceedings began, they tried everything. Twisted emails, misquoted letters, cherry-picked statements from staff, but each time, Robert countered with documented proof, clear timelines, and witnesses loyal to Grandpa's name. Still, the worst came when my mother took the stand. Her voice trembled perfectly. We only wanted to reconnect with our daughter, she said tearfully, dabbing at her eyes. But Emma, she pushed us away. She isolated him. We were just trying to protect Dad's legacy. Her words dripped poison, and I could almost hear Grandpa's warning echoing in my head. Truth, in the wrong hands, turns to poison. But as I watched the judge's expression harden, I realized something: poison only works if it's swallowed. And I wasn't about to drink it. By the second day of the hearing, the courtroom had turned into a battlefield. My parents' lawyer strutted across the floor like a peacock, waving papers and dramatizing every sentence as if we were on live television. But I wasn't there to perform, I was there to end this. Robert rose slowly, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, he said, his voice calm but firm. The defense would like to submit additional exhibits, medical evaluations, witness statements, and the late Judge Whitmore's personal correspondence. And one. The moment the word correspondence left his lips, my mother stiffened. She knew exactly what that meant. Judge Nolan gestured. Proceed. Robert handed him a thick file, and then nodded to me. Miss Whitmore, please take the stand. My heart pounded as I walked forward, my heels echoing on the marble floor. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times. But when I sat down and looked at my parents, the two people who gave me life and then tried to destroy it, my throat tightened. Robert placed the first letter on the evidence screen. Grandpa's handwriting appeared, neat and unwavering. To my dearest Emma, you were never my obligation. You were my choice. If ever you find yourself standing against those who abandoned you, don't hate them. Let the truth defend you. It always will. A hush fell over the room. My mother's perfectly painted expression faltered. My father stared down, jaw clenched. Robert continued, These letters span 10 years, each one affirming Judge Whitmore's mental clarity, affection, and deliberate intent to entrust his granddaughter with his estate. The plaintiff's attorney jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. These so-called letters are emotionally manipulative. They prove nothing. Overruled, Judge Nolan said sharply. The deceased's intent is precisely the matter under review. Continue, Mr. Hayes. Robert gave me a small nod. It was my cue. I took out the leather-bound journal Grandpa had given me when I turned 16. Its pages were worn, its spine cracked from years of use. This, I said softly, was my grandfather's diary. He wrote in it every night until the week he died. End quote. I flipped to the last entry. The ink was faint but steady. My son and his wife live for appearances. My granddaughter lives for truth. The estate must go to her not as a reward, but as a safeguard. She carries my conscience where I can no longer carry it myself. The silence that followed was heavy, sacred. My mother's mask finally broke. He was sick! He didn't know what he was saying, she shouted, rising from her seat. She brainwashed him. Judge Nolan slammed the gavel. Mrs. Whitmore, sit down. Now. Her outburst echoed against the wooden walls before fading into nothing. I looked at her, at the woman who gave birth to me, but never really saw me, and said quietly, "No one brainwashed him, Mother. He just finally saw who you really were." And as I said it for the first time in years, I felt like his granddaughter again, not their pawn. The third day of the trial felt like the longest day of my life. Every breath, every whisper, every creak of a chair echoed inside my skull like thunder. I sat at the defense table, my fingers intertwined tightly in my lap, staring straight ahead. Across from me, my parents whispered to their lawyer, their once confident smirks now brittle and strained. Judge Nolan entered the courtroom, robes swaying, expression unreadable. The audience hushed instantly. He took his seat, shuffled the papers before him, then looked at me. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw something like pride in his eyes. "This court," he began, "has reviewed all submitted evidence, testimonies, and correspondence of the late Judge Henry Whitmore." His tone was calm, measured, the kind of voice that could slice through lies without raising in volume. "What I see before me is not a case of manipulation. It is a case of misplaced greed." A soft murmur rippled through the room. My father's jaw tightened, my mother's hands began to tremble. "The plaintiffs," Nolan continued, "have failed to provide evidence that the defendant exercised undue influence. On the contrary, the deceased's own letters, medical reports, and will demonstrate deliberate, sound judgment." He paused, eyes sweeping over my parents. "Therefore, the court dismisses the plaintiff's claims in their entirety. The will of Judge Whitmore stands. The estate belongs to Miss Emma Whitmore." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then reporters gasped, pens scratching, cameras flashing. But I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, my pulse echoing in my ears. Judge Nolan looked directly at my parents. "Justice," he said clearly, "does not side with blood, it sides with truth." My father slumped back in his chair as if the words had physically struck him. My mother stared at the floor, lips parted but speechless. The gavel came down, a single, sharp crack that felt like the end of a war. When I finally stood, my knees nearly buckled. Robert touched my shoulder lightly. "It's over," he whispered. "You did it." But it didn't feel like victory, not the way people imagine. It felt hollow, like standing among ruins after the fire dies. As I turned to leave, my mother's hand shot out, gripping my wrist. Her nails dug into my skin. "You think this makes you better than us?" she hissed. "You'll regret this, Emma. You'll end up alone just like him." I met her eyes, calm but unflinching. "I'd rather be alone than empty," I said, pulling free. Outside, the sunlight hit me like a cleansing flame. The crowd surged forward, microphones thrust in my face, questions overlapping. "How does it feel to win? What will you do with the money?" I stopped on the courthouse steps, the California breeze tugging at my hair. "It wasn't about money," I said quietly, just loud enough for the cameras to catch. "It was about truth." That night, I sat by Grandpa's portrait, the verdict papers beside me, and whispered, "You were right. The truth really does have long arms." And today, it finally reached back. Weeks passed after the verdict, but peace didn't come easily. Reporters eventually moved on to the next scandal, yet the silence that followed felt deafening. The estate was legally mine now, the mansion on the cliffs, the companies, the legacy, but without Grandpa. It all felt like a museum of ghosts. Every night, I walked through the long hall, lined with his portraits, hearing echoes of his voice in the creak of the floorboards. Power means nothing if you can't sleep with your conscience. For the first time, I slept without fear but not without ache. Then, one late evening, as the sun melted into the Pacific and painted the sky in shades of crimson, my phone rang. The screen flashed an unknown number. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A pause. Then a trembling voice. "Emma?" It was my father. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The same man who'd screamed at me in court now sounded smaller, fragile. I read the journal," he said quietly. "Your grandfather's words. I didn't want to believe them, but I couldn't stop." His voice cracked. "He wrote that I lost my way, that I stopped being his son long before he wrote his will." I closed my eyes. He also wrote that it's never too late to do what's right. He exhaled shakily. I don't deserve forgiveness, Emma. But I needed you to know. I'm sorry. For everything. For leaving you. For blaming you. For being the kind of father he warned you about. His confession hung in the air like something fragile, something sacred. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stared at the garden through the window, the same one Grandpa had planted for Grandma decades ago, and I felt the wind stir through the roses. I don't know if I can forgive you, I whispered. But I know Grandpa would have wanted me to try. I'll take that, he said softly. It's more than I deserve. Before he hung up, he added, You remind me of him, you know. The way you stand your ground. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at the horizon. The world was quiet again, not heavy this time, but healing. I walked out into the garden barefoot, the grass cool beneath my feet. The sun had dipped below the waves, leaving a soft amber glow over the estate. In my hands, I carried Grandpa's old journal. I flipped to the final page, where his last words were written in faded ink. True justice isn't found in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who keep believing in it. I smiled through the tears that finally came. I believe, Grandpa, I whispered. I always will. Somewhere in the wind, I could almost hear his reply, calm, proud, and gentle. Then I can finally rest, my girl. And as the ocean breeze swept through the roses, I realized something beautiful. Justice had been served, but forgiveness, that was the real inheritance.